Somewhere between 1955 and 1985, the American family quietly stopped cooking. Not all at once. Not with a slamming of cookbooks or a national farewell to the apron, meal by meal, week by week, Tuesday by Tuesday. Nobody announced it. No headline declared the death of the roast chicken. No president gave a speech about the last simmering pot of stew. But by 1985, a typical American dinner required 90 seconds of preparation, a microwave door, and the faint plastic whisper of a film being peeled back from a tray. Something enormous had shifted, and most of the people living through it never quite noticed the ground moving beneath their feet. This is the story of how that happened. Not the sentimental version, where a villainous corporation sneaks poison onto the shelf and tricks us into buying it. Not the nostalgic version, where every grandmother was a saint and every dinner a ceremony. The truer story is quieter and far more human. It is a story about economics, about time, about the way a country can change its eating habits without ever deciding to. Because here is the thing that most people miss when they talk about convenience food. The shift from scratch cooking to heat and eat was not primarily about laziness. It was not about the loss of some secret domestic art. It was about arithmetic. It was about a country that had promised one kind of household life in 1955 and by 1985 had quietly, profitably, and almost invisibly rebuilt itself around a completely different one. The kitchen was simply the room where you could see it most clearly. Let us begin where this story always wants to begin, in the 1950s, with the image that got sold so hard it still haunts the cultural memory. A woman in a clean dress, at a gleaming range, timing a pot roast while her husband unfolds the evening paper. That image was not a documentary, it was an advertisement. But like most advertisements, it borrowed from something real. In 1950, only about 24% of married American women were in the paid workforce. 3/4 of them were at home, and a great deal of what they did at home was cook. Bread some days, stew others, a Sunday roast, canning in August, baking on Saturday, putting up preserves. Scratch cooking was not a hobby in 1950. It was a full-time, unpaid job performed by roughly 35 million women, and it was the single largest piece of labor holding the American household together. Then, the ground began to move, slowly at first. By 1970, married women's labor force participation had climbed from 24% to 40%. By 1990, 58%. And by 2020, still 58%, steady as a drumbeat. Read those numbers slowly. In 40 years, more than a third of the country's married women moved from unpaid domestic labor into paid employment. And yet, and this is the pivot on which the entire story turns, the hours in a day didn't change. Men did not, on average, take on anywhere near half of the remaining domestic work. The children still needed to be fed, the kitchen still existed, something had to give. What gave was the pot roast. Betty Friedan in 1963 wrote The Feminine Mystique, and most people remember it as a book about suburban unhappiness. But read it again, and you will notice something else in those pages. Friedan is constantly, almost obsessively, cataloging labor. Hours spent, meals made, floors mopped. She understood, before the statistics caught up, that the 1950s housewife was quietly burning through an unsustainable amount of unpaid work. When millions of women entered the paid workforce in the decade that followed, they did not shed the cooking. They simply had less time for it, and a vast, attentive, patient industry was already standing by, clipboard in hand, ready to sell them the missing minutes back. Here is where we have to pause, because there is an easy mistake to make. The convenience food industry did not win by being good. Not at first, it won by being there. In the 1950s, the early wave of instant, shelf-stable, just-add-water foods was, to put it politely, a rough draft. Instant mashed potato flakes from that era tasted like wet wallpaper paste with a memory of butter. Canned peas had the color of a faded army uniform and the snap of a sponge. The first TV dinner, launched by Swanson in 1953, featured a turkey-adjacent slab, with gravy the consistency of warm pudding and a dessert compartment containing a cobbler that had been baked, frozen, thawed, reheated, and finally served to a family who would, at best, politely finish half of it. The product worked as a novelty. As a routine, it was a harder sell. And here is a sound you should keep in your ear as we move forward. The vacuum seal release of a boil-in bag, that little gasp when you cut it open and the steam rushes out, carrying with it the scent of something that is almost, not quite, recognizable as food. In 1960, that sound was rare. By 1985, it was in half of American kitchens, once a week, twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday, the soundtrack of dinner. So what changed? Why did convenience food go from a 1950s novelty to a 1985 default? The answer is industrial food technology. The 1970s were, for food engineering, the equivalent of what the 1940s had been for aviation, an enormous leap forward, fueled by a combination of government research, corporate investment, and a market that was suddenly, desperately, hungry for what the factories could produce. Freeze-drying, developed originally for military rations and space food, found its way into the grocery aisle. Shelf-stable packaging, pioneered for emergency supplies, became the guts of the instant soup bowl and the boxed side dish. Microwavability, which had been a narrow technical problem, in the 1960s became a design priority by 1975. Food chemists learned how to build a sauce that would not break when reheated, how to engineer a starch that would retain its bite after freezing, how to encase a meal in a tray that could go from the freezer to a microwave to a dinner table in under 5 minutes without exploding, leaking, or collapsing into slurry. These were not glamorous inventions. There were no ribbon cuttings, but they were the quiet engineering miracles that made the 1980s kitchen possible. Consider the microwave itself. In 1975, fewer than 5% of American households owned one. By 1986, more than half did. That is an adoption curve that matches the speed of the smartphone 30 years later. And the microwave, unlike the stove, did not reward scratch cooking. It rewarded products that had been engineered to its particular quirks. Manufacturers knew this. By 1980, the label "microwave safe" was not an afterthought. It was a sales strategy. Products that worked in the microwave moved off shelves. Products that didn't quietly died. Stop and notice something here. We tend to talk about convenience food as if it happened to American households, as if it arrived, fully formed, and people surrendered. But the arrow also ran the other way. American households, under the pressure of new economic realities, went out looking for this food. They demanded it. They voted for it with their grocery dollars week after week because the alternative, cooking 3 meals a day from scratch after a 40-hour work week, was, for most families, mathematically impossible. Let us put a number on it. In 1965, the average American weeknight cook spent about 90 minutes preparing dinner. 90 minutes. That is an actual hour and a half, 6 nights a week, roughly 9 hours a week, devoted just to weeknight meal preparation, not counting weekend cooking, breakfast, lunch, or shopping. By 1985, that number had dropped to about 30 minutes. By 2005, 22 minutes. In 40 years, the country had cut weeknight cook time by roughly 3/4. That is not a cultural drift. That is a revolution. Sylvia Porter, the great economics columnist who wrote for newspapers from the 1930s into the 1980s, saw this coming in her columns. She was one of the few voices in mainstream media connecting household economics to macroeconomics in plain English. Porter understood that the family budget was not separate from the national economy. It was the smallest unit of it, and she noticed, earlier than most, that when a woman's paid wage entered a household, it tended not to make that household richer in leisure. It tended to pay for the outsourcing of the labor she used to perform at home. The dry cleaner replaced the laundry day, the daycare replaced the afternoon at the kitchen table, and the frozen entree replaced the stew. Claudia Goldin, the economist who won the Nobel in 2023 for her decades of research on women in the labor market, has documented this shift with a precision that makes it impossible to dismiss. Her work on the marriage bar, the old informal rule that banned married women from many professions, and on the long arc of female labor force participation, shows clearly that the post-war decades were not a gentle evolution. They were a wrenching, compressed transformation. Goldin's data shows a country adding millions of working hours per week to its economy by pulling women out of kitchens while doing nearly nothing to redistribute the kitchen work itself. That mismatch, that gap between labor taken on and labor shed, is the economic vacuum into which the convenience food industry poured itself. Here is a phrase worth holding on to. Women's wages in the 1970s and 1980s effectively paid for convenience foods. That is not a metaphor. If you look at household expenditure data from the era, the rise in prepared and semi-prepared food purchases tracks closely with the rise of the second earner's income. The dollars that flowed in from a wife's job flowed right back out, in part, to buy back the hours she no longer had to cook. The male wage, meanwhile, had stopped rising in real terms after 1973, so the second income was not, for most families, a luxury. It was a patch on a leaking ship, and the convenience food, bought with that second income, was the plaster over the wound. Now, to understand how this looked on the ground, you have to walk into a grocery store in 1982. Not the one you grew up with, the particular 1982 version. Fluorescent light, aisles wider than they had been a decade earlier, and somewhere near the middle of the store, something new. A heat and eat section, rotisserie chickens under a warming lamp, deli counters slicing meats by the pound, refrigerated cases of prepared side dishes, mashed potatoes in pint tubs, macaroni salad in quart tubs, an entire meal assembled from components available to a working parent at 6 in the evening with 10 minutes and $12. This was brand new. In 1965, the grocery store did not offer dinner. In 1985, it did. And think for a moment about the beep of a first-generation microwave finishing its cycle. That sharp, slightly mechanical tone, not quite a chime, not quite an alarm. It meant dinner. It meant rest. It meant that another weeknight had been survived. For millions of Americans, that beep became the most common kitchen sound of the era, replacing the scrape of a wooden spoon against a heavy pot, the sigh of an oven door opening, the bubble of a long simmer. Stouffer's understood the new landscape earlier than most. The company had been around since 1924, a restaurant chain that eventually branched into frozen food. In 1971, Stouffer's made a bet. They would go upscale. They would target the dual-income household with frozen meals that were a tier above TV dinner fare. Bigger portions, better sauces, a promise right there on the box that this was not the sad aluminum tray your mother had served in 1959. This was something you could put on a plate in a real bowl and not feel like you were cheating. Then came 1981. Stouffer's launched Lean Cuisine, and something clicked. Lean Cuisine was not just a frozen meal, it was a positioning statement. It was aimed squarely at the working woman, the dual-income wife, the professional who wanted to manage her weight, feed her family, and get out of the kitchen in under 10 minutes. The marketing spoke to her directly. Portion-controlled, calorie-counted, elegant, or at least elegant-adjacent packaging. And if you opened one in 1983, you encountered something. That is hard to describe unless you lived through it. The slightly off plastic aftertaste of a 1983 lean cuisine, that faint chemical note behind the tomato sauce. The way the pasta had a texture that was almost al dente but not quite. A kind of engineered resilience that no home cook would ever produce by accident. People noticed, people complained, people kept buying them. By the mid-1980s, another shape began to appear on the American landscape. The rotisserie restaurant, Boston Market, founded in 1985 as Boston Chicken, offered a new proposition. It was not fast food. It was not a sit-down restaurant. It was, essentially, a grocery store meal counter disguised as a chain. You walked in, ordered a half chicken, 2 sides, and a corn muffin, and walked out with something that resembled the Sunday dinner of a generation earlier. Except you had not cooked it. You had rented it for $10.15. Boston Market exploded in the 1990s. Its growth curve was steep, and its existence told you something important about what the American consumer wanted in 1995. Not just speed, not just cheapness, but the texture of home cooking without the labor. Take a breath, because this is where it gets complicated. We have talked so far as if the shift away from scratch cooking was a simple response to economic pressure, and in large part it was, but it was also cultural. By the 1980s, another phenomenon layered on top of the dual-income family. The DINK, dual income, no kids, young, urban, professional couples with disposable income, demanding restaurants and prepared foods, uninterested in standing over a stove after a long day at the law firm. The DINK household, small in number but large in media presence, helped normalize the idea that cooking was optional. That dinner was a product to be acquired, not a process to be performed. Not everyone was thrilled about this. In 1977, Senator George McGovern led a committee that released the dietary goals for the United States. The McGovern Report, as it came to be known, was one of the first serious government attempts to push Americans back toward scratch cooking, at least implicitly. Eat more whole grains, less processed food, less sugar, less salt, more vegetables cooked at home. The report was bold. It was controversial. The sugar industry hated it. The meat industry hated it. And despite the noise, the report did little to slow the convenience food train. You cannot policy argue a household out of a time crunch. You cannot recommend your way past a 50-hour work week and a 30-minute dinner window. Meanwhile, across the country, in a specific zip code, resistance was quietly organizing. In 1971, Alice Waters opened Chez Panisse in Berkeley, California. The restaurant was not, at first glance, a political project. It served local, seasonal, carefully sourced food, cooked with obvious affection. But over the next 2 decades, Chez Panisse became a symbol, a counter-signal, a reminder that cooking, real cooking with real ingredients, was still possible, still valuable, still a form of care. Waters became the patron saint of what would later be called the farm-to-table movement. Her work mattered deeply, but it also revealed something uncomfortable. The return to scratch cooking, when it happened, tended to happen among people who had money, time, a second home sometimes. The revolution Waters helped start was real, but from the start, it carried a price tag. In 1986, on the other side of the Atlantic, an Italian journalist named Carlo Petrini stood in front of a new McDonald's opening at the base of the Spanish Steps in Rome and decided he had seen enough. He founded a movement. He called it slow food. The point was not just culinary. It was political, cultural, ecological. Petrini argued that industrial food was flattening the world, erasing regional traditions, and severing people from the land and the labor that produced their meals. Slow food spread to dozens of countries, including, eventually, the United States. And again, it was powerful. And again, it revealed a pattern. The people most able to embrace slow food tended to be people with time education, and disposable income. The single mother working 2 jobs in Cleveland was not, primarily, the audience. Let us return to the American kitchen, because the 1990s and 2000s brought new waves. The microwave was now universal. The freezer aisle kept expanding, but so did the organic section. The farmer's market scene, a trickle in 1980, was a torrent by 2005. Whole Foods, founded in 1980 in Austin, went national. The idea that your food had a story, a provenance, a set of ethical credentials became mainstream, and yet, simultaneously, actual weeknight cooking time kept dropping. Americans were buying kale at Whole Foods, posting about it on early social media, and then heating up a frozen burrito for dinner. The aspiration and the reality were not the same meal. Then, in 2006, Michael Pollan published The Omnivore's Dilemma, and something shifted again. Pollan was not the first writer to critique the American food system, but he was the one who landed. He walked readers through the industrial cornfield, the feedlot, the processed food factory, and asked, with careful journalistic patience, whether any of this was actually serving us. His books, and the books that followed from other authors in the same lane, did something the McGovern Report could not. They made scratch cooking feel earned again, not as nostalgia, as ethics, as health, as politics. And then came Julie and Julia, the 2009 film, based on the blog and book by Julie Powell, told the story of a young woman in Queens who decided, in the middle of her ordinary life, to cook every recipe in Julia. Childs mastering the art of French cooking in a single year. The film was modest. The phenomenon it triggered was not. Sales of Julia Childs cookbooks, out for 40 years, spiked overnight. Butter sales rose, Dutch ovens started flying off shelves, and, crucially, a new kind of home cook emerged. Often young, often urban, often educated, someone who saw scratch, cooking not as a grandmother's burden but as a creative act, a weekend performance, a way to feel rooted in something older than the microwave. But even this renaissance was partial, because cooking for the Julie and Julia generation was often a weekend project, a Sunday beef bourguignon, a slow braise on a rainy afternoon, the weeknight, the brutal Tuesday at 6:30 with kids, and homework, and an early meeting tomorrow was still the realm of the frozen meal and the takeout container, and the food industry noticed and offered something new. In 2012, Blue Apron launched, and the meal kit was born, or, more precisely, popularized. The meal kit was a compromise, a clever one. It said, in effect, "We know you want to cook. We know you are too busy to shop and plan. We will ship you the ingredients, pre-measured, with a recipe card. You assemble from prepped parts. You still cook, just not all the way from scratch." Blue Apron was followed by HelloFresh, Plated, Sunbasket, Home Chef, and dozens of others. By 2019, meal kits were a $3 billion industry. They were expensive, they were wasteful in packaging, and they told you something profound, that millions of Americans still wanted badly to stand at a stove and feel like they had made dinner. But they could not find the time, the energy, or the planning capacity to do it all. Now, step back. Look at the full arc. From 1955 to the present, a country of scratch cookers became a country of assemblers, reheaters, and takeout orderers, with a minority of devoted home cooks holding the old line. This was not, fundamentally, a failure of character. It was the predictable consequence of a set of economic decisions. Women entered the paid workforce in enormous numbers without the domestic labor load being redistributed. Real male wages stagnated after 1973. Housing, healthcare, and education costs rose. The second income became a necessity, not a choice, and the hours had to come from somewhere. They came from the kitchen. What we gained from this shift was real. Women gained careers, financial independence, retirement accounts, and a measure of autonomy that the 1950s housewife could only imagine. Men, slowly, began to learn their way around a stove. Children learned that dinner could come from many places. The food industry, for all its sins, fed a country through an enormous demographic. And economic transition without mass hunger, which is, in its way, a quiet achievement. What we lost is also real. The rhythm of the daily kitchen, the knowledge passed hand to hand from parent to child, the particular kind of family talk that happens when someone is stirring a pot and someone else is setting a table, the skills of bread, of stock, of preservation, of seasoning by instinct, a certain kind of taste memory, a certain kind of time, and, along with all of that, a certain relationship to the ingredients themselves. A generation grew up without ever having seen a whole chicken broken down, without having smelled yeast bloom in warm water, without the quiet satisfaction of a stew that had simmered since morning. And here is where the story turns toward you, listening now. Because the question on the other side of this history is not whether convenience food was good or bad. The question is harder. Is cooking from scratch in the American economy of today a privilege? A luxury afforded to people with flexible jobs, stable schedules, enough money to shop at the good grocery, and enough margin to spend an hour at the stove on a Wednesday evening? Have we, without quite meaning to, made the simple act of preparing a meal into a marker of class? Think about it carefully. The farmer's market on Saturday morning, the heirloom tomatoes, the cast iron skillet, the sourdough starter with a name. These are beautiful things. They are also increasingly the province of people with time and money. Meanwhile, the single parent working retail hours, the warehouse worker on a swing shift, the home health aide driving between clients, the graduate student at 10 at night. These are the people for whom the frozen burrito is not a choice, but a survival. If scratch cooking has become a hobby, a lifestyle, a wellness credential, then somewhere along the way, it stopped being the default American way of feeding a family, and it became something else, something you can afford or cannot. There is no tidy answer. There is no program, no recipe, no policy paper that will hand back to working families the 90 minutes a day that the 1965 housewife had. Those hours are gone. They were traded for paychecks, for careers, for two incomes, for the house and the car and the kids' activities. And most of those trades, on balance, most Americans would not want to reverse. But the question remains, and it is worth sitting with. If we believe that cooking from scratch matters, for health, for culture, for connection, for the small daily dignity of feeding the people we love with our own hands, then we have to ask, honestly, who gets to do it? Who has the time? Who has the money? Who has the kitchen, the knowledge, the ingredients? And what do we owe the millions of Americans who, through no fault of their own, find themselves on the wrong side of that equation, heating up a tray at 7:45 on a Tuesday night? Because that is what this economy, the one we built together, has left them room for. The beep of the microwave fades. The plastic film peels back. Dinner is ready, or at least dinner is served, and the question hangs in the quiet of the kitchen. Is cooking from scratch a privilege now? And if it is, who gets to afford it? The answer, whatever it turns out to be, will tell us more about this country than any cookbook ever could.